Imagine an ordinary evening. You're at home. It's quiet. Outside the window, the occasional car passes by, the familiar rhythm of life. But at this very moment, thousands of miles away from you, behind closed doors, decisions are being made that could change the entire world. What if a single mistake, a single wrong word, sets off a chain of events that can no longer be stopped? World War III isn't a flash that happens in a second. It's a process, a slow one, almost imperceptible. And that's exactly why it's the most terrifying. In this video, we won't scare you or speculate without basis. We'll calmly and systematically break down the scenario, how it might begin, how events would unfold, and whether there would be a chance to stop everything before it reaches the point of no return. If you're interested in these kinds of in-depth, calm analysis, ones you can not only watch, but also listen to before bed, subscribe to the channel and support this video with a like. That way, you'll help us release more stories like this. And now, let's imagine how it all might begin. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the world before great upheaval. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of held breath, of conversations that stop just before the most important sentence is spoken, of decisions being made in rooms where no cameras are allowed. This is where our story begins, not with an explosion, not with a declaration, not with armies crossing borders in the dead of night. It begins with a gradual cooling, a slow withdrawal of warmth from the international relationships that had, for decades, kept the world's most dangerous forces in an uneasy but functional balance. To understand how the world arrives at the edge of its worst nightmare, it helps to understand the architecture of that balance first. Since the end of the Cold War in 1991, the United States and Russia have maintained what political scientists call a managed rivalry, a relationship defined not by friendship, but by a complex web of mutual deterrence, shared economic dependencies, arms control treaties, and diplomatic back channels. These structures were never elegant. They were patched and repaired over decades, strained by NATO's eastward expansion, by conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine, by sanctions and counter-sanctions, by a deepening competition for influence across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. But they held, imperfectly, grudgingly, they held. What begins to change in the months before the world notices is the integrity of those structures. Arms control agreements that had survived since the 1980s are allowed to lapse without renewal. Diplomatic missions are quietly reduced in size. Military-to-military communication hotlines, the kind established precisely to prevent accidents from becoming catastrophes, are used less frequently and then almost not at all. Intelligence agencies on both sides begin reporting that their counterparts have become harder to read, not because of any single dramatic rupture, but because of the slow accumulation of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one making the next miscalculation slightly more likely. This is how historians, looking back at the great crises of the 20th century, have typically described the pre-conflict period, not as a march toward war, but as a gradual erosion of the mechanisms that make war avoidable. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 is the most studied example. For 13 days in October, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the threshold of nuclear exchange and step back. What is less remembered is the 18 months of rising tension, misread signals, and failed diplomacy that preceded those 13 days. The crisis itself was not a sudden eruption. It was the concentrated expression of accumulated pressure. The pattern has repeated in smaller forms many times since. In the world of our story, several pressure points have been building simultaneously, and the international system has simply run out of the mechanisms it normally uses to release that pressure safely. In Eastern Europe, a long-running dispute over the sovereignty of a strategically important territory has entered a new and more dangerous phase. The specific location matters less than the dynamic. A region where Russian and Western interests directly overlap, where neither side feels it can afford to be seen backing down, and where local actors have their own motivations that do not always align with the preferences of their larger patrons. Proxy conflicts of this nature are extraordinarily difficult to manage because they involve multiple actors with different incentive structures, and because events on the ground can outpace the decisions of governments thousands of miles away. In the Pacific, a separate set of tensions involving China, Taiwan, and American security commitments has been pulling at Washington's strategic attention and the resources. This matters because one of the foundational assumptions of American foreign policy, that the United States can manage crises in Europe and Asia simultaneously, is being tested in a way it has not been since the Second World War. Meanwhile, the global economy is under considerable strain. Energy prices have been volatile. Supply chains, already disrupted by a series of earlier shocks, have not fully recovered. In several major democracies, governments facing internal political pressures have found that projecting strength abroad is, at least in the short term, more politically rewarding than the unglamorous work of coalition building and compromise. This is another pattern that historians recognize. Economic stress and political polarization tend to reduce the appetite for diplomatic concession. Leaders who might, in calmer times, be willing to accept an ambiguous outcome become less willing to do so when their domestic audiences are anxious and their political opponents are ready to portray any compromise as surrender. The people living through this period, ordinary citizens in Moscow and Washington, in Warsaw and Beijing, in Kiev and Tehran, are not for the most part aware of exactly how precarious things have become. Life continues. Shops are open. Trains run. Children go to school. The news reports on the tensions, but news reports on tensions constantly, and most people have learned, reasonably enough, to discount a certain amount of alarm. The phrase heightened tensions appears so regularly that it has lost much of its power to communicate genuine danger. This gap between the actual state of affairs and the public's perception of it is itself a risk factor. Democracies, in particular, require an informed public to generate the political pressure that sometimes forces leaders to pursue negotiation over confrontation. When the public is either unaware of how serious things are, or so overwhelmed by the noise of constant crisis that it has become numb to genuine warning signals, the corrective mechanism weakens. There are people, of course, who are paying close attention. Analysts in government intelligence services are writing assessments that use carefully hedged language to describe scenarios that are, in plain terms, deeply alarming. Senior military officers on both sides are running planning exercises for contingencies they would prefer never to see enacted. A small number of retired diplomats, and arms control experts are publishing op-eds and giving interviews in which they say, with increasing urgency, that the current trajectory is unsustainable. These warnings are noted. They are filed. They do not change the trajectory. This is not because the people in positions of power are stupid or reckless. Most of them are intelligent, experienced, and genuinely do not want a catastrophic war. What they are caught in is something the game theorists call a security dilemma. A situation in which each side's defensive actions are perceived by the other side as offensive threats, requiring a defensive response, which is in turn perceived as an offensive threat, and so on, in a cycle that rational actors find extremely difficult to exit unilaterally. Every additional military exercise makes the other side feel it needs to conduct its own. Every additional deployment makes the other side feel it needs to respond in kind. Every hardened public statement makes it politically harder for leaders to offer the private concessions that might break the cycle. The logic of the situation pulls in one direction, even when the individuals within it would prefer to go another way. The political scientist Robert Jervis spent much of his career studying exactly this phenomenon. The way that structural conditions in international relations can produce outcomes that nobody specifically chose and nobody specifically wanted. This is not a story about monsters. It is a story about a system under stress, reaching the limits of its ability to manage that stress. And so, the world that looks from the outside, like the world it has always been, with its ordinary mornings and its evening news and its unremarkable routines, is in fact something different. It is a world balanced on a point, a world in which the mechanisms that have, for 80 years, prevented the worst from happening are fraying, one quiet thread at a time. The silence is not peace. It is the held breath before everything changes. History's great catastrophes rarely announce themselves honestly. They arrive disguised as something manageable, a border skirmish that officials on both sides describe as an incident, a limited military action that spokespeople characterize as proportionate and targeted, a diplomatic breakdown that analysts call serious but not unprecedented. The language of crisis management is, by design, a language of minimization, because the alternative, acknowledging in real time that something has gone irreversibly wrong, is politically and psychologically almost impossible for those in positions of responsibility to do. This is why the spark, when it comes, does not feel like a spark. It feels, at first, like something that will be resolved by the end of the week. The incident occurs in one of the pressure zones that has been building tension for months, a disputed region where Russian-backed forces and Western-supported government troops have been engaged in the kind of low-intensity conflict that the international community has learned, perhaps too well, to tolerate. These frozen conflicts, as they are sometimes called, have a way of remaining frozen for years, even decades, right up until the moment they do not. What triggers the escalation is, in the immediate sense, a question of genuine ambiguity. A position is shelled. Both sides claim the other fired first. In the age of satellite imagery and signals intelligence, one might expect that the truth would be quickly established. But the reality of modern warfare is that the first hours of any engagement produce a flood of conflicting information, and the actors most motivated to establish a clear narrative are also the actors most motivated to shape that narrative in their favor. The initial casualties are not large by the grim arithmetic of war, but they are significant enough that neither government can absorb them quietly. On the Russian side, the domestic political logic is straightforward. The government has staked considerable prestige on its position in the region. Any failure to respond forcefully risks being portrayed by internal critics and by the public alike as a weakness. And in a political culture that prizes strength as a governing virtue, weakness is an existential threat to leadership authority. The decision makers in Moscow are not indifferent to the risks of escalation, but they are also calculating rationally within their own framework that the risks of non-response are more immediate and more certain. On the American side, the calculus is different but arrives at a similar place. The United States has formal or informal security commitments to allies in the region. The credibility of those commitments, their value as a deterrent against future aggression, depends on their being honored when tested. This is the foundational logic of alliance politics. A guarantee that is not upheld when invoked is not a guarantee at all, and its failure poisons every other guarantee in the system. American policymakers understand that their response will be read not just in Moscow, but in Warsaw, in Tallinn, in Seoul, in Taipei, everywhere that American security assurances are the primary thing standing between a government and its fears. Neither side wants the situation to escalate. Both sides take actions that escalate the situation. This is the security dilemma made operational. The American response comes in the form of direct military support to the government forces, air defense systems, intelligence sharing, and logistical assistance that crosses a threshold Russia has previously declared it would not tolerate. The Russian response to that response involves a limited strike on infrastructure nodes that are, by some readings of the situation, legitimate military targets, and by other readings, a significant expansion of the conflict's scope. Each action is described by the side taking it as reactive. Each action is experienced by the side receiving it as aggressive. This is a pattern that the diplomatic historian Margaret Macmillan has described as characteristic of the period leading into the First World War, a conflict that in 1914 almost nobody wanted and almost everybody contributed to. The leaders of Europe's great powers in that summer were not, by and large, reckless adventurers, eager for war. They were men caught in a system of interlocking commitments, military timetables, and domestic political pressures that stripped away their options one by one until the only paths remaining led to the same place. The parallel is not perfect, it never is, but the structure is recognizable. In the first 48 hours after the initial incident, the United Nations Security Council holds an emergency session. It is largely theatrical. Russia holds a permanent veto. The United States holds a permanent veto. The resolutions that might actually constrain either party cannot pass. What the session produces is speeches, some of them eloquent, most of them predictable, none of them sufficient. Meanwhile, financial markets register their own verdict. Global stock indices fall sharply. Energy prices spike. The Currencies of countries perceived as geographically proximate to the conflict lose value against traditional safe haven assets. These market reactions are not simply expressions of fear. They are, in a real sense, the global economy beginning to reprice risk. Investors, traders, and institutions with long time horizons are updating their models to reflect a world in which the probability of something much worse has increased. The economic signal propagates faster than the diplomatic one. Within hours of the market open in New York, major corporations with operations in the affected region are activating contingency plans. Supply chains are being rerouted. Insurance underwriters are adding war risk exclusions to policies. These are not panicked decisions. They are the ordinary responses of institutions managing exposure to a changed risk environment. But they have consequences. They begin to shift the material reality on the ground in ways that make de-escalation incrementally harder. Ordinary people, too, begin to adjust their behavior in ways that seem small individually, but add up to something significant collectively. In several European capitals, there are lines at ATMs as people withdraw cash. Hardware stores report unusual demand for flashlights, batteries, and water filtration equipment. In online communities, conversations that would normally focus on sport or entertainment fill instead with speculation, rumor, and the sharing of links to government emergency preparedness pages. The human response to perceived threat is not irrational, it is adaptive. People have an instinct, honed over millennia, for recognizing when conditions are becoming dangerous, and for taking actions to protect themselves and their families. But these individual adaptive responses can, in aggregate, create dynamics that complicate the political situation further, producing a public mood of anxiety and urgency that makes it harder for leaders to pursue the slow, unglamorous, uncertainty-laden work of de-escalation. Leaders, after all, respond to publics as well as to adversaries. By the end of the first week, what began as an incident has become a crisis. The language used by official spokespersons on both sides has hardened. The word limited continues to appear in official statements, but the gap between what the word is meant to imply and what is actually happening has become visible enough that serious journalists and analysts have stopped using it without quotation marks. The most important communications are now happening out of public view. Back channels that were established precisely for moments like this are being activated. Some of them formal, some of them operating through intermediaries in neutral capitals, some of them relying on personal relationships between individuals who have known each other for years and who are now, quietly and urgently, trying to find a way to stop the logic of the situation from running to its conclusion. Those conversations are happening. That matters. But so does this. The mechanisms of escalation have their own momentum now. Military assets are positioned. Political commitments have been made publicly. The window in which a quiet, face-saving climb down was straightforwardly available has already passed. The world has not yet crossed the threshold that separates crisis from catastrophe. But the distance to that threshold is shorter than it was 7 days ago. And it is shortening. There is a concept in complex system theory called a phase transition. The moment at which a system under increasing pressure does not gradually degrade, but abruptly reorganizes itself into a fundamentally different state. Water does not slowly become ice, it remains liquid, and then, at a precise threshold of temperature and pressure, it transforms. The change is discontinuous. The rules that governed the previous state no longer apply. International crises behave this way. For weeks, sometimes months, the system absorbs pressure. Diplomatic communications continue. Markets fluctuate but do not collapse. People go about their lives with a background awareness that something serious is happening, but retain a reasonable faith that the institutions designed to manage these situations will, as they always have before, find a way to manage this one. And then something shifts, not always a single dramatic event, but a convergence of pressures that crosses a threshold, and the world that existed the previous morning is simply gone. The shift, when it comes, arrives in a form that is almost mundane in its mechanics. A military commander in the field, acting within the rules of engagement he has been given, but at the outer edge of what those rules were designed to authorize, orders a strike on what his intelligence assessment identifies as a command and control facility. The assessment is not wrong exactly. The facility does serve a military coordination function, but it also sits adjacent to civilian infrastructure, and the strike produces casualties and secondary damage that exceed what was anticipated. More importantly, it exceeds what the other side can absorb politically without a response that is visible and forceful enough to satisfy its own domestic audience. The response is not nuclear. It is not even by the standards of large-scale conventional warfare, particularly massive, but it involves assets and targets that had not previously been engaged. It crosses a line, not a formal, treaty-defined line, but the informal line that both sides had been observing, the line whose observance had been the primary thing keeping the conflict bounded. Once that line is crossed, the logic of restraint loses much of its power. This is one of the most important and least understood dynamics of modern conflict escalation. The restraints that prevent wars from expanding are not primarily legal or physical. They are psychological and political. They depend on both sides sharing a rough consensus about where the boundaries of acceptable action are. The consensus does not need to be formalized. It operates through signals, through precedent, through the observed behavior of each side over time. But once it breaks down, once one side takes an action that the other side experiences as a fundamental violation of the understood rules, the shared framework collapses, and each side must now make decisions without the stabilizing assumption that the other will continue to exercise restraint. Military planners have a term for this. They call it escalation dominance. The idea that in a conflict, each side tries to ensure that it has the capability and the will to match and exceed any escalatory move by the opponent. The logic of escalation dominance, once engaged, is deeply difficult to interrupt, because each defensive move is experienced by the other side as an offensive provocation requiring a defensive response. Within 72 hours of the crossed line, the conflict has expanded geographically, kinetically, and dimensionally. Geographically, engagements that were previously confined to the original dispute zone have spread to neighboring areas. As each side moves to secure positions it fears the other will exploit. Alliance commitments, formal and informal begin to activate. Countries that have been carefully positioning themselves as neutral find that neutrality is becoming harder to maintain, not because they're being coerced, but because the conflict's expanding footprint is making it physically and economically impossible to remain uninvolved. Kinetically, the tempo of military activity increases on multiple fronts. Airspace over contested regions is effectively closed to civilian traffic. Maritime movements in several strategic waterways are being monitored and, in some cases, intercepted. Cyber attacks, the steady low-level digital conflict that had been ongoing for years before the first shot was fired, escalate sharply, targeting not just military infrastructure, but power grids, financial systems, and communications networks. A major port loses electrical power for 18 hours. A regional internet exchange point goes offline. A hospital network in a mid-sized European city loses access to its patient record system. These cyber incidents cause no immediate deaths, but they demonstrate something important and frightening: the vulnerability of the interconnected systems on which modern life depends. Every digital device, every networked infrastructure, every automated system that makes contemporary civilization function is, in principle, a target. The recognition of this vulnerability, the sudden, visceral understanding that the war is not happening somewhere else, to someone else, changes the psychological experience of the crisis for ordinary people in ways that no previous conflict has quite done. Dimensionally, the conflict is no longer only military. It is economic, informational, and social simultaneously. Major central banks hold emergency meetings. The International Monetary Fund activates crisis protocols. Commodity markets, already volatile, experience swings in prices for energy, grain, and critical minerals that threaten to produce food insecurity in parts of the world far removed from the conflict zone itself. This is one of the features of a globalized world that is easy to overlook in peacetime. The supply chains that deliver affordable food, medicine, and manufactured goods to billions of people are optimized for efficiency, not to resilience. They function beautifully when conditions are stable. They fracture rapidly when conditions are not. The informational dimension is equally consequential. Both sides are engaged in intensive efforts to shape the narrative of the conflict, not just for international audiences, but for their own domestic populations. State media in Russia presents the conflict as a defensive response to Western aggression, an existential struggle against forces that have been trying to encircle and weaken Russia for decades. Western media presents it as an unprovoked assault on the rules-based international order, a test of whether democracies have the will to defend their values. Both narratives contain elements of truth. Both omit elements that would complicate the picture. Populations consuming these narratives are not, for the most part, receiving the information they would need to form an accurate assessment of what is happening and why. This informational environment, polarized, saturated, and deliberately manipulated by multiple actors, makes the political management of the crisis harder. Leaders who might wish to pursue compromise find that their domestic information ecosystems have already convicted the other side, making any concession politically toxic. Public opinion, which in a democracy is a genuine constraint on government action, has been shaped by weeks of crisis coverage into something that demands strength and fears any appearance of capitulation. Governments across the world brief their populations on civil preparedness measures. Reserve military personnel are called up. Energy rationing is discussed in cabinet meetings that are officially still described as precautionary. The word precautionary is doing an enormous amount of work. Cities look largely the same. The shops are still open. The streets are still populated. But the texture of daily life has changed in ways that are difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. People are quieter on public transport. Conversations between strangers are more guarded. The particular quality of social ease that peacetime produces, the unconscious confidence that tomorrow will broadly resemble today, has begun to erode. Humans are extraordinarily adaptable. They can normalize almost anything given enough time. But this has not yet had time to be normalized. It is still new enough to be frightening. And frightened populations, led by leaders under pressure, in a system whose stabilizing mechanisms are failing one by one. This is the precise configuration that history has shown, repeatedly and without exception, to be the most dangerous. The phase transition has occurred. The world that existed before is gone. What comes next depends on decisions that have not yet been made. There is a word that appears with increasing frequency in the classified briefings being delivered to heads of state on both sides of the conflict. It appears in the assessments prepared by nuclear weapons laboratories, in the contingency plans held in reinforced safes in military commands, in the quiet conversations between senior officials who have spent their careers hoping never to have to use it in earnest. The word is threshold. In the formal doctrine of nuclear strategy, a threshold is the point at which a state considers the use of nuclear weapons to be justified, or more precisely, the point at which the calculus of the costs and benefits shifts enough that nuclear use becomes a live option rather than an unthinkable one. Every nuclear-armed state has a threshold. Most of them have several, arranged in a rough hierarchy from the least to the most catastrophic. And the entire architecture of nuclear deterrence, the system of mutual assured destruction that has, since 1945, prevented nuclear weapons from being used in war, depends on those thresholds never being reached. The problem is that thresholds are not fixed. They move. They move in response to events on the ground, to the domestic political pressures on leadership, to the perceived intentions of the adversary, and to the cumulative psychological weight of a crisis that has been running for weeks without resolution. A threshold that seemed comfortably distant at the beginning of the conflict looks different after a series of escalations has eroded the buffer zone between conventional warfare and something worse. A red line declared in public becomes a political commitment that is difficult to walk back without catastrophic loss of credibility. And credibility, the adversary's belief that you will do what you say you'll do, is the currency on which deterrence runs. This is the landscape in which the most dangerous phase of the crisis unfolds. Neither the United States nor Russia has used nuclear weapons. That remains true. But both sides have taken actions in the past 2 weeks that have moved the conflict closer to the territory where the logic of nuclear deterrence begins to operate differently than it does in peacetime. Russian strategic nuclear forces have been placed at an elevated alert level, a change that is detected immediately by American surveillance systems and reported to the president within minutes of its occurrence. The United States responds by adjusting the alert status of its own forces. These are, in the clinical language of nuclear operations, signaling actions. Moves designed to communicate resolve and capability without actually firing anything. But signaling actions carry their own risks. One of the most studied dangers in nuclear strategy is what theorists call the stability-instability paradox. The paradox works like this. The very robustness of nuclear deterrence at the strategic level, the certainty that a full-scale nuclear exchange would be suicidal for both sides, can actually make conventional conflict more likely, because each side believes that the other will not escalate to nuclear use, and therefore feels freer to press its advantages at the conventional level. The result is a situation in which the umbrella of mutual deterrence, rather than preventing conflict, contains it while allowing it to intensify. The paradox has a corollary. As conventional conflict intensifies, as losses mount and political pressures build, the threshold for nuclear use, which deterrence theory assumes to be stable, can begin to shift. The side that is losing conventionally faces a choice between accepting defeat and reaching for options it had previously ruled out. This is precisely the scenario that arms control experts have warned about for decades, and precisely the scenario that is now, in the classified briefings of two nuclear-armed governments, being discussed with a specificity that would have seemed academic a month ago. The American president receives a briefing from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that runs to 47 pages. She reads all of it. The Russian president receives a similar assessment from his own military leadership. Neither document is optimistic. Both documents make clear, in the careful language of professional military analysis, that the current trajectory, if unaltered, leads to places that cannot be recovered from. It is at this point that something shifts, not on the battlefield, but in the decision-making calculus of the people at the very top of both governments. There is a historical parallel worth examining here. In October 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev received pressure from their respective military establishments to take actions that, in retrospect, could have triggered nuclear war. Kennedy was advised to launch airstrikes against Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Khrushchev was advised to maintain his position and not back down in the face of American pressure. Both men, looking directly at the abyss, chose differently than their advisors recommended. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey as part of a back-channel deal. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange. Neither concession was announced publicly in terms that made it look like capitulation. Both leaders understood that the alternative to a faith-saving compromise was no faith at all. The back channels that matter in our story are not the public ones. They are not the speeches at the United Nations, nor the statements issued by press offices, nor the carefully worded communiques that say nothing while appearing to say something. They are the conversations that happen through intermediaries, through the Swiss Foreign Ministry, through private individuals with long relationships on both sides, to the kind of quiet diplomacy that leaves no official record and receives no official acknowledgement. These conversations have been ongoing since the first week of the crisis, conducted by people whose names will never appear in the news coverage, operating in the spaces between the official positions that neither government can publicly abandon. What makes these conversations possible, what gives them any chance of producing an outcome, is a shared recognition that has slowly and painfully made its way to the top of both governments. It is not a recognition that anyone on either side is right or wrong. It is not a recognition that the other side's position is legitimate or that one's own position is indefensible. It is a simpler and a more primal recognition than any of that. It is the recognition that the people in these rooms, on both sides, have children, that the cities whose destruction the war plans contemplate are full of people who woke up this morning and made coffee and helped the children with homework and worried about ordinary things, that the abstraction of strategic assets and collateral damage and acceptable losses refers, when the language is stripped away, to human beings who have done nothing to deserve what the logic of the situation is preparing to do to them. This recognition does not, by itself, stop anything. History is full of leaders who understood the human cost of their decisions and made them anyway. Understanding is not the same as action, but it creates a condition, a psychological opening that skilled diplomats can work with. Nuclear strategists sometimes speak of the nuclear taboo, the powerful normative prohibition against nuclear weapons use that has held against considerable pressure since 1945. The taboo is not written into any law. It is not enforced by any institution. It persists because the leaders who have faced the choice of crossing it have, one after another, found that they could not. Not because they were certain it would be suicidal, though it likely would be, but because some things, once done, cannot be undone. And the people in these rooms, in this moment, on both sides of a conflict that has brought the world to the edge of its worst possibility, understand this in a way that is no longer theoretical. The threshold exists. Both sides can see it clearly, and neither wants to be the one who crosses it. Wars end the way they begin, not all at once, but in stages. The ceasefire, when it comes, is not announced with fanfare. There's no signing ceremony, no symbolic handshake in front of cameras, no moment of cathartic release that the world can point to and say, there, that is where it ended. What happens instead is quieter and more ambiguous. A gradual slowing of military activity, a series of understandings communicated through the same back channels that spent the past weeks trying to prevent the worst, and a careful, coordinated set of public statements from both governments that describe the outcome in language calibrated to allow each side to tell its own population that it has not lost. This too is historically consistent. Most major conflicts do not end with one side's unconditional surrender. They end with negotiated outcomes that leave the underlying tensions unresolved, the fundamental disagreements unaddressed, and both sides nursing grievances that will, if not carefully managed, become the seeds of the next crisis. The armistice that ended the First World War in 1918 is the most instructive example. A settlement so punishing to Germany, and so poorly designed to address the structural conditions that had produced the war, that it functioned less as a peace than as a 20-year pause before the same forces reassembled into something even worse. The people designing the framework that ends this conflict are aware of this history. Whether they are able to do better is one of the most consequential open questions of the post-crisis period. What the settlement establishes, in its essential outlines, is a mutual withdrawal from the positions each side had advanced to during the conflict, a set of monitoring mechanisms intended to verify compliance, and, most importantly, a renewed commitment to the communication channels and arms control frameworks that had been allowed to atrophy in the years leading up to the crisis. These are not generous concessions. They are, in a meaningful sense, a return to the status quo ante, an agreement to restore, imperfectly and incompletely, the architecture of managed rivalry that existed before the spark. Neither side has won, neither side has lost, at least not in the terms their publics were given to understand. What both sides have done is survive, and survival, in a conflict that came as close as this one did to crossing into territory from which there is no return, is not nothing. But the costs of even this incomplete, inconclusive outcome are real and will be felt for years. The economic damage is substantial. The conflict's disruption of energy markets, supply chains, and financial systems has produced inflation, shortages, and contractions in GDP across dozens of countries that were not direct participants in the fighting. For wealthy nations with robust social safety nets, this translates into hardship, rising prices, reduced public services, political instability. For poorer nations without those buffers, it translates into something considerably more serious. Food insecurity has increased sharply in regions of Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia that depend on grain exports from the conflict zone. The humanitarian consequences of a war fought primarily between powerful states will be borne disproportionately by people who had no voice in the decisions that caused it. This is a pattern so consistent across the history of great power conflict that it has the quality of a law. The people with the least power to prevent wars are the people who pay the highest price for them. The infrastructure damage, physical, digital, and institutional, will take years to repair. Several countries in the conflict's geographic periphery are rebuilding electrical grids and communications networks. International institutions that were already under strain before the crisis have been further weakened by it, not destroyed, but diminished. Their credibility as arbiters of international order reduced by the demonstrated inability to prevent or contain the conflict. The United Nations, NATO, and several other multilateral bodies are entering a period of difficult internal reckoning about what they are for and whether their current structures are adequate for the world that now exists. The psychological costs are harder to measure, but no less real. An entire generation of people across the affected regions has experienced something that previous generations, born into the relative stability of the post-Cold War order, had assumed was safely historical. The genuine, lived fear that a great power conflict could destroy the world they knew. That fear does not simply evaporate when the ceasefire is announced. It settles into the collective consciousness and changes behavior in ways that persist long after the immediate threat has passed. It changes how people vote, how they save money, how they talk to their children about the future, and how much trust they extend to the institutions and leaders who were supposed to prevent this from happening. Trust, once lost, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. And trust in governments, in international institutions, in the basic proposition that the powerful have some obligation to the powerless, is precisely what the crisis has consumed in enormous quantities. And yet, here is what is also true, and what the accounting of costs and damages must not be allowed to obscure. The worst did not happen. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the most important thing. The conflict came close enough to nuclear use that the people who study these questions for a living, the arms control experts, the strategic analysts, the former officials who know what the classified assessments actually said, will spend years processing how close it actually was. The margin was not comfortable. It was not the result of the international system working as designed. It was the result of individual decisions made under enormous pressure by people who were frightened and exhausted and operating with incomplete information. To step back from a threshold that, once crossed, could not have been uncrossed. Those decisions matter. They should be remembered. Because one of the things that this crisis, for all its horror, has demonstrated is that the nuclear taboo, that powerful, unwritten, unenforced prohibition against the use of the most destructive weapons ever built, held. It held not because any institution enforced it. It held not because any treaty required it. It held because the people who faced the choice of crossing it, when that choice became real rather than theoretical, found that they could not. That is a form of hope. It is not a comfortable or complacent form. It comes with the full understanding of how close things came and how different the choices of different individuals might have been. But it is real. What comes after is, in many ways, harder than what came before. The work of rebuilding, economically, institutionally, psychologically, is slower and less dramatic than the crisis itself, and it receives less attention. The arms control frameworks that need to be renegotiated are technically complex and politically thankless. The institutional reforms that might make the next crisis less likely to occur or easier to manage if it does require sustained political will across multiple governments over multiple years. Precisely the kind of long-term, unglamorous commitment that democratic systems find most difficult to sustain. None of this is guaranteed to succeed, but it is being attempted. And the people attempting it are doing so with a clarity of purpose that comes only from having seen directly and without abstraction what the alternative looks like. There is an old observation, attributed in various forms to various statesmen, that nations and individuals alike tend to make the wisest decisions only after they have exhausted every other option. It is not a flattering observation about human nature, but it contains a form of qualified optimism, that even after everything else has failed, wisdom sometimes arrives. That even at the edge of catastrophe, the capacity for better judgment is not extinguished. The world that exists after this crisis is not the world that existed before it. It is more fragile in some ways, and perhaps more clear-eyed in others. It carries the weight of what almost happened, and the knowledge, hard-won, expensive beyond calculation, of exactly how close the edge really is. That knowledge is not comfortable, but it is the beginning of something. And beginnings, however painful their origins, are where everything that matters starts.